And thanks to Jane and Susie and Helene and everyone in the gallery for making this possible and for giving us the opportunity to speak about a subject which is both passionate and very little known, and that is the French history in the United States. I'm not sure what you know about this history. If you're like me, before I wrote this book, I knew that the French helped us out in the American Revolution and that we bought the Louisiana territory from France for $15 million, and that was about it. As a matter of fact, I think most of us in school are taught the British history of the United States. We know Plymouth, we know Jamestown, we know the 13 colonies. But I wonder how many of us know about Cahokia in what is now Illinois, or Vincennes, which is now Indiana, or Michilimackinac, which is now in Michigan, or Sainte Genevieve, which is in Missouri. I would venture to say that very few of us know this. At least I didn't until I started doing the research for this book. I am from Texas, and I cannot remember being taught in Texas history that there was a major French colony in Texas of about 300 men and women who came from Paris, who came in 1684, who founded a fort called Fort St. Louis, which was only uncovered actually in the 1990s, and who were led by the most celebrated of all the French explorers, a certain Robert Cavelier de La Salle, the same La Salle who in 1682 descended the Mississippi from what is now Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, all the way to what is now New Orleans, and claimed this vast territory from the Rocky Mountains to the Alleghenies for France. Compare that territory to the British colonies on the East Coast. The territory is something like 2 million square kilometers, 4 times the size of France. And yet the French history in the United States lives in clouds among our school children. I'll give you a little bit of background about the book. Most of you have seen the book downstairs. Several years ago, the French Heritage Society approached me as an American journalist living in France to do a book about the French heritage in the United States to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase, which was in 2003. This was an intriguing idea, I must say, but not being a historian and not being an architect, I hesitated. I knew enough about history to know that after the French were defeated at Quebec in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham, that was pretty much the end of the French dominance of North America. And the question I had was, after 250 years, were there enough French traces left to fill a book? It was complicated by the fact that French Heritage Society did not want a textbook. What they wanted was a visual history of the United States. So, in order to do that, I, along with a very gifted photographer, Arielle la Tour d'Auvergne, made 3 separate trips to the States. We photographed more than 150 sites. We took more than 1,000 photographs, or rather Arielle did, of which some 300 ended up in the book. And what we found was that the French heritage is surprisingly in very good health in the United States. So in the next hour or so, I want to go through that heritage and discuss it with you. Perhaps the best way to start is to ask a question. Why did the French come to North America in the first place? Well, I think there were principally 3 reasons. The first was commerce. It had long been the dream of the French monarchy to find a water route to the Far East. And so that the first French explorers who came to North America, and this was Jacques Cartier in 1534, Samuel Champlain around 1607, 1608, even La Salle some decades later, were less interested in colonizing this territory than in finding a way across it to go to the Orient. And it was only when go back. It was only when a young French priest by the name of Jacques Marquette entered the great river to the west in 1673, which he named Colbert after the French Minister of Finance. It was only after that that the French settlements began springing up along the rivers in North America. So if you're talking about commerce, you also have to mention fur, because it was the dream of Louis XIV and Colbert, shown here, to develop North America for the commercial benefit of France. And largely that meant fur, because there was a considerable demand in France and in Europe for fur from North America. Above all, the beaver, which was used in hats, in the linings of coats, and for several other reasons. Well, eventually the trade got saturated and it crashed, but the same settlements that were originally set up as fur trading posts continued to survive, such as Michilimackinac in Michigan, now called Mackinac, St. Ignace in Wisconsin. These villages survived. So the first reason they came was commerce. The second reason was politics, because during the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a long series of wars between the French and the British over commerce and territory. And eventually these wars spread to North America. And so I think one can say that one of the main reasons for the French to be in North America was to prevent the British from dominating it. This was true in the French and Indian War from 1756 to 1763, called the Guerre de Sept Ans in France. It was also true in the American Revolution, where, of course, there was a certain idealism in France, particularly among the nobility, for the French cause. But more important than that was that the French saw the Americans as a counterbalance against the British in North America. And I think you can also say the same of the Louisiana Purchase, which came along in 1803 for the same reason, one of the reasons that Napoleon sold Louisiana Territory to the United States. So in this particular book, one more thing I wanted to talk about. We talked about commerce, we talked about politics. The third reason the French came was religion, and here you have to mention the Jesuits, who had a great interest in civilizing the Indians, converting them to Christianity, and a number of the early French settlements which sprung up in North America were Jesuit settlements, such as Cahokia in the state of Illinois. And if you're talking about religion, you also have to mention the Huguenot. I know there are some people here tonight from the Huguenot Society. As you probably know, the Huguenots were French Protestants who were severely persecuted in France during the 16th and 17th century. And the worst event of that period occurred in 1572, the so-called Feast of Saint Barthélemy, when thousands and thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered after the marriage of Henry IV and Queen Margot and thrown in the Seine. When Henry IV came to power, Henry IV being a Protestant d'origine, he promulgated something called the Edict of Nantes, which protected the Huguenots in certain important regions of France. But when Louis XIV came into power, he revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and the massacres continued, and then thousands of Huguenots fled. They fled to England, they fled to the Netherlands, they fled to Germany, they fled as far afield as South Africa, and a few thousand made their way to North America, where the Huguenots from the village of La Rochelle founded the village of New Rochelle in New York, also founded the village of New Paltz in New York, which even today has a Huguenot street with Huguenot dwellings. There was an important Huguenot settlement in Staten Island. There were settlements in Maryland, settlements in Virginia, in Charleston, and South Carolina. And by way of an incident, I should report that my partner and I were in Charleston a couple of years ago, and we went to the Huguenot Church, which still exists. We were fortunate to be there on the one weekend when the service was in French. As we were leaving the church, we noticed a plaque on the wall which listed all of the American presidents which were in some way descended from Huguenots, from all the way from George Washington to George Bush. Don't ask me how those links were made, but nonetheless, there were 21 American presidents that in some form or another were descended from Huguenots. Now, our book, French America, concerns several aspects of the French heritage in the United States, but the most important of these is architecture. And we're going to talk about 4 principal kinds of structures tonight, which still exist. But before we do, perhaps some terminology would be useful. This is a partial facade of the Cahokia Courthouse in Cahokia, Illinois. Cahokia is a small village across the river from St. Louis. Cahokia Courthouse dates from 1699, beautifully preserved. Notice the vertical log structure. This is the same kind of structure that you find in certain regions of Normandy. Where I have a home in the Pays d'Auge, we have a home which looks very much like this. Between the vertical logs, you'll notice there are bricks. The French settlers called that briquette entre poteaux, or brick between post construction. But there are other materials also used as infill between the posts, the most important of which was called bousillage. Bousillage, after the French word boue, which means mud. And bousillage is a mixture of mud and straw, sometimes cow dung, and as you get farther south down into Louisiana, Spanish moss. Bousillage is a very good insulation for houses. The word in French is torchis. Torchis. It's the same as bousillage. There's also a possibility of having just stones between the posts, and the settlers called this pierrotage. Pierrotage, after the French word pierre, for stone. You notice the posts here arriving on a wooden base. This kind of architecture is called poteau sur sol, post on a sill construction, and you'll see that in some of the buildings we'll show you later. If the posts go directly into the ground, that's called poteau en terre, or post in the ground construction. Now, obviously, there are very few of those buildings left. There were 5 before Katrina. I think there are only 4 now, and 3 of them are in one village. The reason is because if you put posts in the ground, they rot because of humidity, because of insects, various other reasons. So it's very rare to find poteau en terre. This is to give you a sort of base. Now, when you arrive in a savage wilderness, which is what North America was in those days, what is the first thing you want to do? Well, you want to protect yourself. And so it is no surprise that among the first French structures built in North America, sorry, it wasn't the United States, built in North America were fortresses. And when the French came to North America, they brought with them the idea of a fortress developed by a certain Sebastian Vauban. Vauban was the chief military engineer for Louis XIV, and he had a conception of a certain kind of fortress, a star-shaped fort with 4 corners which protruded from the walls, the reason being to direct an unimpeded field of fire upon an attacking force. And you can see the bastion here at the corner of the fort. This is Fort Ticonderoga in New York, on the border between New York and Vermont. It's a stone fort, and in that sense atypical of the French forts, because there are only 2 French stone forts in the United States, the other being Fort de Chartres in Illinois, which is a very good reconstruction. This fortress was the site of a very important battle during the French and Indian War in 1758, when a French force of 4,000 defeated an English force 4 times as large under General Abercrombie. It wasn't a lasting victory because the British took the fort back the next year, then the Americans took it over, and now it is a museum. It can be visited. It has a very impressive collection of cannon. As I said, most of the forts in the United States, the French forts, were wooden, flimsy, palisaded structures, poteaux en terre, and they disappeared without a trace. But they have been recreated. This particular fort is Fort Jean-Baptiste in Louisiana. There's also Fort Crèvecoeur in Illinois. There was Fort Maurepas in Biloxi, but I rather doubt it's still there after Katrina. This is the powder magazine. This fort, Fort Jean-Baptiste, was built in the early 1700s. It housed members of the French Navy, a very early settlement. The furnishings here are rustic and were modeled after furnishings of the period. The second kind of structure we want to talk about are the Creole cottages. This particular house, called the Martin Boismenu House, is in Dupo, Illinois, next to Cahokia. You see, not everything is in Louisiana. Next to Cahokia. Now, there are certain characteristics of the Creole cottage which you can see in this. This roof structure, with the short angle here and the long angle here, I used to call this a double-hipped roof, but an architect in Lafayette a couple of days ago said, no, it's a gabled roof. In any case, it is a special angle roof, which comes out and covers the porch, which the French settlers called a galerie. Now, the galerie had certain advantages. First of all, it protected the house from the blistering humidity and heat and sun of the Middle West. It was also a social space, because even in a cottage like this, you might find a family of 10 to 15 people. Families were large in those days, and so you needed not only to entertain the neighbors, but you needed to escape the family. So you get out here as a social space. Another characteristic of Creole cottages is that there's no central hallway. You go directly into the house. You move from room to room. It's symmetrical, 2 rooms in front, 2 rooms in back. Now, there's an interesting story behind this house, because it didn't always look like this. It was covered with some terrible siding. It was run down, used it as an apartment house, and it was about to be torn down for a car wash. But there was a fire chief, a local fire chief, who was a historian, who looked at the house and thought there might be something interesting underneath. They ripped off the siding, and they found a Creole cottage built in around 1790 by a French farmer. It is 80% original. Inside, the fireplace is original. The floors are original. It's furnished in the same rustic style as it would have been in those days. It is a museum, and you can visit it. This particular house, which is called the Amoureux House, is in Sainte Geneviève, Missouri. I don't know if you've ever been to Sainte Geneviève or ever heard of it, but Sainte Geneviève has more French vertical log colonial structures than any other town in the world. It is a town of around 4,500, about 60 miles southeast of St. Louis on the Mississippi. It has retained its French flavor. If you walk the streets of Sainte Geneviève, you can imagine being transported to a French provincial village. It's quite extraordinary. Once again, you notice Once again, you notice the roof line, the double angle here. The roof is held up by what is called a Norman truss. A Norman truss, for those of you who don't know, is a large vertical beam that arrives on a horizontal beam and serves to support the roof. But this house is different, because in this case, the posts here go directly into the ground. This is one of the 3 poteaux and terre houses in Sainte Geneviève, Missouri. It is a museum. It also can be visited, and a very interesting house indeed, largely original. Also in Sainte Geneviève, Missouri, this is the Louis Bolduc House. Again, the roof line, the same double-angle roof line. Louis Bolduc was a wealthy merchant who arrived in Sainte Geneviève, a French-Canadian, who arrived in Sainte Geneviève in the 1760s. Around 1790, built his dream house. Poteau-sur-Sole construction, you can see here. It is probably one of the best, if not the best, recreation or restoration of a French Creole cottage in the entire middle Mississippi Valley. Beautifully furnished inside with a wonderful fireplace, and of course this superb boxwood garden behind the house. This is a rear view. This is a another view of the gallery of the Louis Bolduc house. You can see how it protects the house from the heat of the sun. Of course, the gallery can be a lot more sophisticated than this. Oops. Oops. Gosh. Very sensitive. This is the gallery of the James Pitot house in New Orleans. James Pitot was from Normandy. He was the first mayor of the town of New Orleans. He built this house around 1805. These exquisite thin colonnettes on the gallery. Oh, shoot. Exquisite thin colonnettes on the gallery. A very elegant house. A museum, I believe, run by the city of New Orleans. I had heard that this particular gallery was severely damaged in Katrina, but I'm told this is not the case. It is still there, and you can visit the James Pitot house as well. Well, come on. We're going to look at a couple of interiors now. This is the interior of the Pierre Menard house in Kaskaskia, Illinois. Pierre Menard was a French-Canadian who became quite wealthy and became the first lieutenant governor of the state of Illinois. He built this wonderful house in Kaskaskia, Poteau-sur-Saulx, Poteau-sur-Saulx, with a beautiful garden in front of it. And this is the interior view. This is the kitchen. The kitchen was set apart from the rest of the house, as was the custom in those days, because of the fear of fire. Three of these walls are in wood. The fourth wall is in stone, and there's a crane, original crane, to hold pots over the fire. This house is another interior. This is in Cahokia, Illinois, again. This is the Nicolas Jarreau house. Nicolas Jarreau came from Franche-Comté, arrived in Cahokia in the 1780s, made a fortune, and built this, which is the first brick house in the state of Illinois, in a federal style. This majestic hand-carved stairway would have been the envy of his neighbors, who were probably living in the kind of simple Creole cottages that you saw in the Martin Boismenu house. A little later, this is an interior view of the Châtillon Dimenil house in St. Louis, one of the few French houses remaining in St. Louis, because the freeways that slashed across St. Louis pretty well eliminated most French structures, sadly. And this one was only saved because a conservation society talked to the highway department and convinced them to move the interstate 500 feet to the north to save the Châtillon Dimenil house. Châtillon was a fur trader. He was immortalized in Francis Parkman's classic, The Oregon Trail. He built this house around 1848, filled it with elegant 19th century antiques, and these painted window shades were typical of the time. We're going south now. This is the kind of view that people dream about when they think of Louisiana. This is Lake Martin near Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, with the cypress trees sunk in the water and the Spanish moss. Apparently a stunning sight in spring, when there's thousands and thousands of migratory birds that stop here. This lake is almost totally unspoiled. It's one of the great sights in the South. And next to this lake is this house called Maison Madeleine. The story behind this house is also quite interesting. The lady who owns this house wanted to live in an original Creole cottage. She searched for a couple of years and didn't find one. They're very rare, the old Creole cottages. She finally found this wreck in the middle of a sugarcane field. She disassembled it, put it on flatbed trucks, trucked it to this place next to Lake Martin, reassembled it, put bousillage in the walls, made it the Poteau-sur-Saulx construction. It is now a very charming B&B, and if you go to Breaux Bridge, I strongly recommend it. Does anyone know what this large kettle is in front of the house? It's for sugar cane. It's for sugar cane, yeah. This is a decorative feature which is very common in Louisiana gardens. And by the way, I've thrown around this word Creole quite a bit. What is Creole exactly? Well, Obviously, it's a style of architecture, it's a style of cuisine, but it's something else. Is it black people? No? Anyone know? It is the children of French or Spanish settlers born in the New World. It's all it is. It's all it is. That's what Creole is. So if you hear Creole and you think it's simply a question of race, it has absolutely nothing to do with race at all. I'm going to get to the Cajuns later, but since you bring it up, well, let's wait till later, and then I'll answer your question, because I get to the Cajuns a bit later in the presentation.
Ron, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Is that a real duck or a decoy in that big duck?
I haven't got the slightest idea. I suspect it's a decoy, but I don't know. I really don't know. I really don't know. By the way, you can interrupt at any time. This is not a formal presentation, so if you have questions, interrupt at any time. This is another Creole cottage. This one is in Lafayette, Louisiana. Poteau-sur-Saule again. Notice the raised cottage. That's to allow air to circulate under the house. This is a restoration of an original Creole cottage dating from 1790. This is the Alexander Latoulet house. The fences of cypress, and of course the Spanish moss, the typical Louisiana scene. Getting a little more sophisticated here. This is a maison de planteur. It's called Chêne Verte. It's located in the suburbs of Baton Rouge. Before I go any further, I should give you a little background about the name Baton Rouge, because it's always been intriguing to me. When the French explorer Bienville was looking for a site for a capital of French Louisiana, he went up the Mississippi and stumbled on this plot of ground and noticed a stick in the ground covered with animal remains, that is, blood and so forth. In other words, a bâton rouge, a red stick, and that's where the name Baton Rouge came from. In any case, the story behind this house is even more dramatic than the story behind Maison Madeleine, because this lady also wanted to find an original Creole house to live in. And after a long search, she did find it. The only problem was it was on the wrong side of the Mississippi. So she disassembled it and floated it across the Mississippi on barges, loaded it then on flatbed trucks, closed down the interstate, and took the remains of this house to this particular place in the suburbs of Baton Rouge, reassembled it. It is now an extremely elegant home, and this beautiful French garden, parterre garden, was modeled after a diagram in the New Orleans Historical Archives, Notarial Archives. You notice the double gallery here this time. This is, obviously, we're getting a little more luxurious than the simple Creole cottages. A couple of interior shots. This is the James Pitot house again. The interior, this table here, one of these gaming tables, is a Louisiana antique, apparently very rare, from the early 1800s. And this is the bedroom in the James Pitot house with a superb four-poster bed. And the bedspread is Acadian. Now I'll answer your question. In 1755, the Acadians, who were French settlers in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, were expelled from the territory by the British in what is known as the Grand Dérangement, or the Great Upheaval. Thousands of them died. Some made their way back to the Poitou-Charentes region of France. A few thousand scattered around North America. And when the Spanish took over the Louisiana Territory in 1762, because the French ceded it to the Spanish to prevent the British from taking it over, the Spanish government needed manpower. So they asked the Acadians who had been expelled from France, from Nova Scotia, to come back. And few thousand Acadians came back and settled in various parts of the United States, above all in central Louisiana, where the word Acadian became Cajun, with their own distinct culture, their own recipes like gumbo, their own dances like the fée dodo. It is still a very interesting subculture in Louisiana. They still speak French, some of them. It's a kind of French I don't understand, but my partner understands it. You have to realize that in Louisiana, for about 30 years, from about 1920-something to 1950-something, French was forbidden to be taught in the schools. So a whole generation was lost. And so that's why there's not more French spoken in Louisiana today. And of course, as time passes, they get more and more assimilated into the culture. But there is still a distinct Acadian presence, Cajun presence. And that is not the same as Creole. The difference has nothing to do with the children of French or Spanish settlers born in the New World. It's a totally different subculture. The next structures we want to look at are the plantations. And first it should be said that a plantation is not simply a house. A plantation is normally a series of buildings. Not only this, a main house, but there's also overseers' cabins, slave cabins, garçonnières for the young boys, and so forth. Perhaps you have an idea of plantation life that you got from something like Gone with the Wind, where women are sitting around in their crinolines waiting for the next ball. But it wasn't like that at all. It was a tough life. The humidity was terrible. Disease was rampant, cholera and yellow fever. The slaves were dropping off like flies. Very often the men were gone. The women ran the plantations. It was a functioning business, either cotton or sugarcane, and not an easy life whatsoever. This particular plantation is probably the most authentically restored of any plantation in Louisiana. This is Laura, founded by a certain Guillaume Dupart from Normandy in the early 1800s. It is named Laura because that was the name of a daughter of one of the descendants, a certain Laura Lecoul Gore, who wrote a diary about plantation life called Memories of the Old Plantation Home, which describes in very graphic detail how difficult the life was on plantations. This is a two-story brick and cypress home. The bricks were made on the property by slaves. There is a rather tragic story here because in 2004, this house had a terrible fire. A lot of it was burned. A lot of the artifacts of the family were burned. The owners had searched all around the world to find the original artifacts to go in this home. Some of them were saved. The facade apparently was not damaged. The rear of the house was damaged, but it has now been brought back to life. It is accepting visitors again. And this is the pantry at Laura, the oldest room in the house. The walls were never painted. This dirt on the walls is actually soot from thousands of candles which were used as lighting in the house. This is the room off of the dining room. This is the cover of our book. Certainly one of the most beautiful plantations in Louisiana. This is Parlange along the False River, farther north in Louisiana. Parlange is the only Louisiana plantation to belong to descendants of the same French family for 250 years. It is simple and yet elegant. It has a very dramatic history revolving around a woman named Virginie de Tournon, who managed to save the plantation during the Civil War by entertaining the Union troops who were camped out on the property, charming them and so forth. They spared the plantation. It is now virtually unchanged from its appearance 250 years ago. And on the property you have pigeonnier, the only octagonal pigeonnier in Louisiana. There are two of these. The top floor was used for raising squab, and downstairs was the tutor, the French tutor for the family. The second pigeonnier was in the second pigeonnier lived a gardener who came from the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. Pigeonnier was a sign of prestige in these homes. You find a lot of these in Normandy, but I don't know of any octagonal pigeonniers. They're brick, made of brick. This plantation has a somewhat different form. This is Melrose in Natchitoches, Louisiana, which I always thought was pronounced Natchitoches, but it is Natchitoches. This is Melrose Plantation. The double gallery again, brick again, bousillage filling. The two ends of the plantation were extended to make, the main house were extended to make room for bathrooms. The story of this plantation is quite an interesting one, and it revolves around a slave with the rather exotic name of Mary Therese Coin Coin. Mary Therese was apparently very beautiful, was the mistress of the owner of the plantation, a French planter with the name of Auguste Metoyer. They had 10 children together. Of course, they could never marry, impossible, but at his death, Auguste liberated Mary Therese, gave her a small plot of land. She started growing indigo and cotton. She eventually bought all of her children out of slavery, and at her death in 1817, she owned hundreds of acres of land and more than 100 slaves, which is quite surprising to some people. Black people owned slaves. These are the so-called gens de couleur libre, the free people of color. They owned slaves. This was the richest family of blacks in the United States. And every year there is a reunion of the descendants of Auguste Metoyer and Mary Therese Coin Coin, where apparently thousands of people come. I think there are more than 10,000 descendants. And they come and they congregate around Melrose for a reunion. This is a very, very elegant plantation. This is Hummus House along the river road between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. These massive Tuscan pillars and the cupola on top, I think it's the only one I know of, and these 3 prominent dormer windows on the roof. Hummus House at one time was the largest sugar plantation in Louisiana. It had 20,000 acres and more than 800 slaves. But with the sugar crisis in the 1920s, and of course with the end of slavery after the Civil War, more and more parcels of the plantation were sold off, and now instead of 20,000 acres, there are 27. It can be visited. It is a museum. It is a very beautiful interior, and one of the most impressive features of the interior is this stunning helix spiral staircase. The owner opened the top, put a Palladian window at the top so that light could fall upon the staircase. Very, very impressive. You probably know this plantation, or have seen the photo. This is called Oak Alley for obvious reasons. This is also along the Mississippi between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. These oaks were planted more than 350 years ago. No one knows by whom. There are 28 of them. There are 14 on each side, running from the front of the plantation to the Mississippi, and there are 28 Tuscan pillars around the house to reflect the 28 oak trees. The galleries are several feet deep. It is a mixture of Greek Revival and Creole styles. It has been lavishly furnished. It was, as was the case with a number of plantations, it fell on hard times. In the 1920s, it was pretty much a mess. Cattle were roaming through it, bats and so forth. It was taken over by a family, the Stewarts, who brought it back to health. It is now lavishly furnished with superb antiques. Nothing original in the house except one cradle in the baby's room. But the owners of the house had decided that they didn't want the oak trees. They wanted the oak trees to be clean, so they took off all the Spanish moss. You can decide whether that's a good idea or not. But it is one of the South's most stunning sights. It is a museum. it can be visited. Okay, we've talked about fortresses, we've talked about Creole cottages, we've talked about plantations. The fourth kind of structure are the churches. Of course, the churches can be very simple, the simple wood churches that were Jesuit chapels, or they can be quite elaborate, like the Cathedral of St. Louis on Jackson Square in New Orleans. This particular church is in New Paltz, New York. It's a Huguenot church, and in some ways atypical because it is in a form that you don't normally find. But you have to realize that the Huguenots in New York, or New Amsterdam at that time, settled among the Dutch and the Germans and adopted a lot of the severe, sober style of architecture. It's a very simple, unadorned church. There's no bell tower. There's only a weather vane on top and the tombs of some of the Huguenot settlers below. Oops. This is my favorite French structure in the United States. This is the Holy Family Church in Cahokia, Illinois. There's not a nail used in this structure, only wooden pegs. It was built in 1799. Like a lot of the French structures, it didn't look like this in the 1980s. It was used as a garage, covered with some terrible siding. They stripped off the siding, and they found the original vertical walnut logs there. And it is beautifully designed on the interior. It is a real jewel of French architecture. And I strongly recommend, if you go to Cahokia or even St. Louis, go to see this church. It's very special. This is the interior of a church called the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Kaskaskia, Illinois. Kaskaskia is not a name exactly that rings in the mind, but for one period, first of all, it was founded in 1675. For one period in the early 19th century, it was one of the major cities in the Illinois Territory. It had 7,000 to 9,000 inhabitants. It was the gateway to the West. It had a daily newspaper. It had trade going up and down the Mississippi. But in 1881, there was a flood on the Mississippi, and parts of the town fell into the river. And now, instead of 7,000 or 9,000 inhabitants, it has 75. It is an island in the middle of the Mississippi, but it has two absolutely superb French structures. This church and this altar, which is a tree trunk hollowed out in back and hand-carved, walnut. And the second structure is a shrine next door to the church with a bell in it, which is as large as the Liberty Bell, and was given to the village of Kaskaskia by Louis XV, with a note above the bell saying, "To the village of Kaskaskia from the king across the sea," all on this little island. Our last religious building is not a church, but it is a convent. This is the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, which was one of the only French structures to survive two terrible fires that swept through New Orleans at the end of the 18th century. It is rather classic construction, 2.5 stories, six prominent dormers on the roof, and statues of prominent French figures in Louisiana history, among them Saint Rose Philippine Duchesne, who founded the Sacred Heart Academies in the United States. The story of the Ursulines is one of the great stories of courage in early America. The Ursulines came from Rouen in 1727. There were 12 of them. After a terrible voyage when most of them were violently ill, they arrived in New Orleans. They started the first school for Indian and blacks. They started the first orphanage and the first shelter for battered women. It's a very interesting story, the Ursulines. This particular convent is no longer used as a convent. It is the administrative center. The convent is outside of the French Quarter. Before we close, I think I should say a few words about the Louisiana Purchase, which is clearly one of the 2 or 3 most important events in American history, along with the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Civil War. What you have to realize is that Louisiana was not French from 1762 to 1800. It was Spanish, because, as I said, France ceded Louisiana to Spain to avoid the British taking it over. In 1800, Napoleon took repossession of Louisiana. Jefferson, who was president at that time, and as you know, Jefferson was not simply a statesman, he was a biologist, he was an architect, he was an inventor, a real Renaissance man, also a controversial one, who spoke out against slavery his entire life, and who had a liaison with one of his slaves, which produced a number of children. So some people would call him a bit of a hypocrite. Nonetheless, a remarkable person. Jefferson detested Napoleon because he thought Napoleon had betrayed the ideals of the French Revolution. And Jefferson did not want to see a foreign power, particularly France, led by Napoleon, controlling the mouth of the Mississippi. So he sent 2 envoys to Paris to negotiate the sale of New Orleans. He sent James Monroe, here in the center, later President of the United States, and Robert Livingston to negotiate with the French Foreign Minister Barbé-Marbois and Napoleon and Talleyrand. Well, after weeks and weeks and weeks of tedious negotiations, the Americans were astonished when Napoleon offered to sell not simply New Orleans, but this entire Louisiana territory, 2 million square kilometers, 4 times the size of France. The price eventually agreed on was $15 million, or about 4 cents an acre. Now, the Americans didn't have $15 million, so they had to borrow the money from European banks. Does that sound familiar? In any case, it immediately doubled the size of the United States, and today the Louisiana Territory contains 13 states. Now, why did Napoleon sell it? Well, there were several reasons. First of all, he needed money for his wars in Europe. Secondly, he saw the Americans as a counterbalance against the French. But perhaps the most important reason was because the French had just suffered a disastrous defeat in Santo Domingue, against the Dominican Republic. A slave revolt had killed more than 50,000 French soldiers who also died of yellow fever and so forth. So Napoleon was in no mood for another North American conquest. And there was a fourth reason, too, and that is Louisiana just didn't pay off. It was a drain on the French treasury. They had to dragoon prostitutes and convicts to come here. It wasn't like the British, who came voluntarily. The French did not come voluntarily for the most part, so he wanted to get rid of it. His brothers were against it, but nonetheless he decided to do it. And it's been called the greatest real estate deal in history. And to conclude with the urban architecture a bit, when it came time to choose a capital site for the United States, it had to be something that was not too far north and not too far south. So they finally decided on a swamp, which was along the Potomac River. And in order to develop a plan for this piece of land, George Washington employed a young French engineer, a military engineer, by the name of Pierre L'Enfant. And L'Enfant was asked to develop a plan for Washington. This is his original plan. It is the plan of Washington today. L'Enfant was very deeply influenced by the plans for Paris and Versailles, the long sweeping avenues leading to public spaces. And he built Washington as a classic. It's very, very few countries that have the possibility of building a capital from the ground up, from zero. And L'Enfant had a sense of history. If you look at the plan of Versailles and the plan of Washington, you can see the similarities. And you see this is taken from John Kennedy's grave. This is the sweep of the main avenue up to the Lincoln Memorial. L'Enfant, by the way, is buried next to John Kennedy in Arlington Cemetery. And a number of French architects were very influential in building Washington. One of the most important was Benjamin La Tour, who did most of the work on the U.S. Capitol, and also did work on this is an early drawing of the White House. La Tour was the one who added these pavilions at each end and added this semicircular south portico, which still exists on the White House today. Other French architects made very important contributions to Philadelphia and Washington and Boston. And a lot of American architects studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. and were heavily influenced by this kind of architecture. Do you know this building? That's right. It's the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. Jefferson, who, as I mentioned, was an architect and was a great admirer of French architecture, admired above all this building, which he called the most precious morsel of antiquity handed down to us. He was very influenced by the classical nature of the building and its perfection, its proportions. And when Jefferson went back to Virginia to help plan the capital at Richmond, along with a French architect named Clearaceau, he took with him the ideas of the Maison Carrée. If you look at the two together, you can see the Maison Carrée, in a sense, recreated in Richmond.
What does carré translate to?
Square. Square. Jefferson also very much admired this building. Do you know this one? This is in Paris. It's next to the Musée d'Orsay. It's the Palace of the Legion of Honor, which is also called the Hôtel de Salm. Jefferson used to walk in the Tuileries virtually every day, and he would look at the facade of this building, which he thought was a perfect combination of classical architecture and the intimacy of a Parisian hotel particulier. And when Jefferson went back to the States to construct his own home at Monticello, he took with him the ideas he gathered from the Hôtel de Salm in Paris. Jefferson's home, which he built over 40 years, was the first American home with a dome. Well, that's more or less the end of our slides. I hope that can give you just a small idea of the richness of the French heritage in the United States. And I hope that you'll have an opportunity to visit some of these sites. If you have any questions about any of this, I'm more than happy to try to answer them. Yes?
Mr. Katz, I spent part of my childhood growing up in Florida in the Tampa Bay area, and I remember summer camp at a park, Philippi Park, and it was where Count
Fort Caroline. Fort Caroline.
Yes, I wondered if you did any
Fort Caroline was a Huguenot settlement in 1572. One of the very early settlements in Florida. All of the settlers were wiped out by the Spanish, who didn't want interference in their territory. And when they were all put to the sword, and there was a sign saying they died not as Frenchmen but as Lutherans, because they were Protestants. Now, Fort Caroline has an important history in North America. Yeah. Anybody else? If not, thank you very much for your attention.